Hello and welcome to Move or Improve with Debbie. I'm Debbie Miller and I wanted to welcome you today to my show. Thanks for listening. With Halloween on the horizon, I thought it would be interesting to talk today about the possibility of buying a haunted house or a stigmatized house, and we'll find out what exactly that means. There's several categories out there, and I've invited Jessica Youngs to join me on the show today. Now, she was with us a few sessions ago. She talked about the ABCs of HOAs and condominiums, and we had a very interesting discussion. It was a popular show. So she's an attorney who, for the past several years, has provided legal counsel to real estate title companies. She's based in Virginia. So the advice she's giving is not generic to the country, but you need to seek independent legal counsel for the area that you're in. But she can give you a good idea of what to ask for. She's currently working for Case and Associates law firm, and they are counsel to Champion Title and Settlements, which is across the country. So this would be a good start if you need to get title information about a property you're interested in. And she has conducted thousands of real estate settlements in the Northern Virginia area and is experienced in teaching realtors and loan officers and other attorneys on a wide range of real estate related topics. She graduated from American University with a BS in Business Administration and got her law degree from George Mason University School of Law. So welcome today, Jessica. We're glad to have you back.
Oh, thank you so much for having me back, Debbie.
Not a problem. Let's get started to the good stuff, because every time I talk to somebody about this show, they all say, oh my gosh, I have a story to tell. A stigmatized property is a home. It's a non-traditional purchase. And there can be a variety of reasons why a home is classified as stigmatized. Believe it or not, Forbes magazine had an article in 2018 that said 33% of American home buyers are open to living in a spooky abode. But according to a poll by Realtor.com, 25% disclosed that they would consider buying a haunted house. So what is a stigmatized property? Well, it's a house or a dwelling that stigmatized buyers or tenants may shun for reasons that are unrelated to the physical condition or the features. These can include like the death of an occupant, murder in the house, suicide, or a belief that the house is haunted. And a criminal stigma is this type of home has been used as a meth lab or a drug den. And most states do require disclosure of this type of use, and Jessica's going to get into that a little more detail. But just because there's no physical dangers from the stigma of a crime being committed doesn't mean that you as a buyer should overlook this important point. You have to do your due diligence. Many states do have disclosure forms that sellers must complete, but Jessica, you want to talk about some examples that would help with this?
Absolutely. So recently I saw a news story, a news article that popped up from NBC News, and they had a story about a pregnant woman. She and her husband had recently purchased a house in Missouri, and when she got her blood work back because she was pregnant with their first child, it came back that she tested positive for meth, and she was not, she was not on any drugs, so obviously this was quite shocking. And what they discovered is that even though Missouri law requires a seller to disclose if the home was used as a meth lab, the authorities had never, said that this was a meth lab. It was never advertised in that way. And they purchased it, and unknowingly they purchased this home that was actually contaminating them. So what was found is that their carpet, their paint, literally everything in the house was contaminated, and it was seeping through, and it actually got into this lady's circulatory system. So luckily, the news story did say her unborn child is fine, so that's good, but she and her husband are now stuck in the position that they need to do something to correct the contamination, and it's going to cost them more than $100,000 to remediate this damage.
Oh my gosh, well, who has to pay for that? I mean, doesn't the seller responsibility?
That's the thing. So they could go back and sue the seller, but I mean, maybe drugs pay well. I don't know, but it's, as they say, it's sort of hard to get blood out of a stone. So it sounds to me like they're in the position that they're going to have to come up with this money themselves. They've even started a GoFundMe page. And with further research, they actually found that law enforcement officers had seized drugs from this house, including meth. So it sort of was a known meth lab, but it didn't show up on any of the state registries, and it wasn't disclosed when they purchased it.
So so the seller should have disclosed that? Was the seller the meth dealer that did the meth, or was that?
I believe in this case it was actually sold like on the courthouse steps. So in that case, there wouldn't be any liability if it had been sold by the actual drug dealer or somebody subsequent to them who knew that they hadn't cleaned up the damage and that this had gone on in the house. I believe virtually every state requires disclosure if there was a meth lab in the house. And certainly lenders will not lend on a property that hasn't been cleaned up from the meth lab contamination.
So it's definitely buyer beware. Boy, that's a scary thought, but especially since she was pregnant. But I'm sure you have some other examples that you can share with us. So
absolutely.
Yeah. Tell me about the one where the husband struck his wife to death with the hammer. That's
this is so creepy.
He was having a bad day. He was having more than just a bad day.
I would say so. Yeah. So this is a famous murder case out of Los Angeles. And this doctor struck his wife to death with a hammer, as you said, and also severely beat his daughter. And then he took his own life. And a year after the murder-suicide, this mansion in LA was sold to a couple who only used the home for storage. They never stayed there overnight. They just put their junk there. They never did anything. They never cleaned up the scene, nothing. Then in 1994, their child inherited the house from them. That child also never lived there and never made any changes to the property. And even to this day, it's still untouched. So I feel really bad for all these poor neighbors who are sitting around this property that's just fallen into beyond disrepair since this murder case decades ago now. But there's gawkers that come by occasionally, and apparently the neighbors have even reported people having picnics in the backyard.
Oh my gosh. Jeez.
Ugh.
Well, doesn't California require, I know where the Sharon Tate murders took place years ago, you have to disclose, but it's only if it occurred within the previous 3 years?
Yeah, so I can't speak to California law specifically, but many states do have more strict disclosure requirements, certainly than Virginia. California and New York among them, for sure. There's a lot more that you have to disclose. But for example, I had a real estate agent just ask me yesterday, and she said, I took my buyer to see this house, and I have a question. Do you have to disclose if there was a murder or suicide that took place? And my exact answer was, well, only if they didn't clean up the blood. And I kind of laughed. Well, it turned out this house that she took her buyer to was being sold as is. And sure enough, they hadn't cleaned up the blood from the murder.
Oh, jeez. Well,
so when she asked the listing, I know.
Oh my God. Well, I had a weird situation a couple months ago. I was showing a property, and I did not know the potential buyers, but they wanted to see it, and I was doing it as a favor for another realtor. And they came in the house, and they didn't say, "Oh, hello, Debbie, thanks for meeting us here," or that wasn't the first thing out of their mouth. First thing out of their mouth was, "Did anybody ever die in here, and is it haunted?" And I thought that was so odd, but then it started me thinking, and therefore that's one reason why I wanted to do this show with you, because I thought, I've never had anybody ask me if a house is haunted, and how in heaven's name would I know? And as far as I could tell, that I had just talked to the two owners that morning, so I knew they were both alive and kicking. So it was just weird, but to have somebody ask that was just kind of weird. But I understand that Florida doesn't have any mandate for disclosure, and North Carolina, you don't have to volunteer it, but if you are asked a direct question, they have to respond truthfully. But it seems to me like any buyer who's interested in any property should ask the question, correct?
Absolutely. The worst that you get is, I don't know, and at least then you ask the question, so you tried.
But now I found a couple of websites that you can log on to. One is called House Creep, and the other one is something about dying in the house. And you can put the address in there. It's called diedinhouse.com and then housecreep.com. And you can put the address in and find out what's going on with that particular property. If not only bed bugs and insects and animals and all kinds of stuff going on, but did somebody die or was they murdered in there? So it's not as bad as it used to be when you didn't have any kind of internet access at all. So
absolutely, those are two great resources.
Yeah, and Virginia, as you know, is buyer beware, caveat emptor, and so it's just interesting that it would differ from state to state, and that buyers really do have to be careful. But then there's another type of stigma, the debt stigma, and that means that the former occupant didn't pay their debt, and the debt collectors aren't necessarily aware that a debtor has vacated the property. And so you have to check with the state for disclosure information. But does that include auctions on the courthouse steps as well?
So that's a great question. So if you're buying a property at auction, you have to be really, really careful as a buyer, because what you're agreeing to is you'll take on any of the liabilities, any of the problems that are currently existing with the property, and there is no duty of disclosure to you as the purchaser, at least in the states that I'm licensed in. So if there's a mortgage that has gone unpaid, if there's multiple mortgages or liens against the property, if the person had a lot of debts and the debt collectors were there, or even if the person is still in the home, even if they shouldn't be, if you become the new owner, if you buy that property at auction, then that becomes your problem to evict the physical people out of the house, to remove anything from the house, and to notify the creditors and pay off any creditors that have liens against the property. So it's very, very risky to do that. So you definitely want to do your due diligence. At a minimum, you should get a title search ahead of time. And even if you do that, until that gavel comes down and the money is handed over, that closing hasn't happened yet. So any creditor who comes in there and files a judgment against the property, that's going to be attached to your new home. And that could be $1 or that could be $1 million. You just never know.
Yeah, because you also have to absorb any tax liens that are out there still outstanding. And a lot of times the person who lives in the home will negotiate and stay, and so you show up at the courthouse steps and then you find out on that day, oops, it's not going to take place after all. So it's not a real easy method of purchasing, but it is interesting.
Absolutely.
So you don't know, when you're buying this type of property, what do you recommend other than a title search? Would a title search will show up any tax liens and that sort of thing that are on the property?
Yes, absolutely. So if you don't have to purchase it at the courthouse steps, it's definitely best not to. So hopefully you can get it when it's still part of the, pre-foreclosure process. So it's in process, it's going to go to auction, but it hasn't actually hit the auction steps yet, because then it gives us a little bit more time as a title company. You can bring us the contract and we can do a full title search, we can clear title, and as long as it hasn't gone to auction yet, if that closing happens, then all the creditors, if there are any, would have been paid off at the closing. The bank has approved of everything, and everybody walks away happy. So you can still walk away with clear title if you have a little bit more time. So I would definitely say if you're interested in distressed properties, obviously they should contact an expert like yourself to walk them through the process and point them to the right people. But also try not to wait to the last minute at that auction, because it's very rare that people get a deal. And if you do, then you've really done a lot of the legwork and due diligence well ahead of time.
So in other words, HG